Hello all, we hope you are well. This workshop was recorded on July 16th, 2020 at 1:30 p.m. through Mid-America Arts Alliance's Engage program. Unfortunately, we had a delay in the recording, therefore the recording did not include the introductions. Feel free to fast forward. However, for those of you who do not know much about Mid-America Arts Alliance or Engage, allow us to reintroduce ourselves. Mid-America Arts Alliance is a service nonprofit regional arts organization representing Arkansas, Kansas, Missouri, Nebraska, Oklahoma, and Texas, focusing on strengthening communities and improving lives through extraordinary cultural experiences. We are artists, administrators, historians, preservationists, preparators, writers, painters, photographers, and activists. The Engage program provides community-centered professional and organizational development that focuses on leadership training for small to mid-sized arts and cultural organizations. Using a combination of workshops, coach consultations, and peer-to-peer learning opportunities, Engage works with participants to govern more effectively, become more fiscally astute, and develop strategies to address community needs. Development of these skills ensures long-term sustainability and improved community impact. Engage is Mid-America Arts Alliance's professional development program for small to mid-sized organizations. Engage provides focused professional and organizational development training using a combination of peer learning, coach consultations, and workshops. The Engage program is designed to strengthen participants' organizational effectiveness and sustainability, amplifying an arts ecosystem that supports the wider community. Now please allow me to introduce our workshop facilitator, Dina Bailey. As a leader of Mountaintop Vision, Dina Bailey has over 15 years of experience in formal and informal learning. Using a unique approach that combines research and empathy, bias, diversity, equity, and inclusion with strategies and techniques from the fields of anthropology and transitional justice, Mountaintop Vision specializes in supporting organizations as they transform themselves into places that consistently center inclusion in decision-making and action. She has worked with a variety of clients such as American Alliance of Museums, Atlanta History Center, Napier Settlement, and more. She has a proven record of fostering organizational growth and strengthening institutional infrastructure while resolving multiple and complex challenges. Bailey is a national and thought leader with recognized national and international experience as a trainer, author, speaker, and facilitator on the trends, challenges, and opportunities that face organizations in the midst of transforming themselves into more equitable and inclusive institutions. Bailey asks that you be open to her guiding principles. Be curious and open, listen for understanding and check your assumptions. Recognize that this is not a debate. Be patient and bring your whole self. Try to acknowledge when you are uncomfortable. Be open to changing your mind. Now for the workshop.
So with those guiding principles, I'd love to move forward with the next part of our discussion. The power of perspective. So this is a fable, an African fable, and I, of course, would like to read it out loud for those of you who perhaps don't have access to the screen or don't have the ability to see it. So a man and a lion traveled together through the forest. They soon began to boast of their respective superiority to each other in strength and prowess. As they were disputing, they passed a statue carved in stone, which represented a lion strangled by a man. The man pointed to it and said, "See there how strong we are and how we prevail over even the king of beasts." The lion replied, "This statue was made by one of you men. If we lions knew how to erect statues, you would see the man placed under the paw of the lion." Right? So sometimes when we're thinking about history, we're thinking about art, we're thinking about any of these big monumental things, right? Even concepts. We don't always think about where they come from, right? In the past or in the present. And so, just again, for a second, I'd love for you all in the chat box just to write out a phrase or two about what you could learn from this fable. What do you think about perspective in terms of this fable? Give you a few seconds to do that. Remember, it's about sharing with others so that they can learn from you and you can learn from them. Wonderful. I see those answers coming in. Thank you for participating. All right. So we've started with the idea that people have different perspectives and we need to use critical thinking in terms of where those perspectives come from or what certain things, statues being an example, are representing certain perspectives. The second aspect that I want to layer into this is called the Four Truths, and it comes out of the South African Truth and Reconciliation Commission. So for those of you who are less familiar, the South African Truth and Reconciliation Commission came following apartheid. Basically, the commission said we need to hear people's stories, hear what happened to them, in particular to the political crimes that were committed during apartheid. And so they created these commissions, and the commissions were about healing. So for some people, they would be able to share their story, the thing that happened to them, and ask for healing, right? And they may get amnesty. That was not true for everyone, but it gave people a chance to say, as a survivor, this is what happened to me, or I know a victim and this is what happened to them. But also someone could say, I was a perpetrator and this is what I did, right? So that truth telling was really important. That said, as the commission was continuing, they realized that they were perhaps paying more attention to people who were presenting in one way than to people who were presenting in another. And so they came up with this idea of there being four different truths. And researchers are now talking about how many different truths there might be, but I will start with these four. There is forensic truth, personal truth, social truth, and reconciliatory truth. Right? Let me explain these. When we think of forensic truth, those are the sources that we most often consider to be facts. So they might be the dates, the times, the maps, right? The laws, the documents that we have, like the Declaration of Independence. Those are the things that we most often consider to be facts, the forensic truth. And for many of us in arts and cultural organizations, this is where we like to live, right? This is the truth that we see by as professionals often. But next, we have personal truth. Personal truth are the lived experiences of people. So this might be a diary, a letter, it might come in the form of a memoir or an oral history. It is basically from your own perspective. And it might include something that you have heard from someone else, right? So the story that your grandfather told about the Jim Crow era, right? What it was like to be in segregation. Now, sometimes forensic truth and personal truth are in alignment. And sometimes those are two different things. So for example, you all have probably heard about witness testimony and being on a jury. So at a trial, if you have four different witnesses and they all saw a car crash, right? There is forensic truth, there is evidence that supports this car crash. But there are also the witnesses. And so one witness says it was a dark blue van that hit a white car. And another says it was a black van that hit a white car. And a third witness says it was a metallic gray van that hit a white car. And then the fourth witness says, no, it was a dirty brown van that hit the white car, right? So there is forensics with that. We know, based on the crash site, what the color of the car was. But if you are talking to those witnesses and they are swearing, right, as part of their jury testimony, that this is what they saw, they believe that this is their personal truth. Now that is when forensic truth and personal truth perhaps don't align. But again, there are many examples when personal truth and forensic truth do align, right? Let me give you the next one to add another layer to this. Social truth. When we think about social truth, those are the major narratives that are largely accepted by a societal group. Now, a societal group could be about geography, could be about class, could be about race and ethnicity, could be about gender, lots of different groupings for this, right? But they're the major narratives. So when you're thinking about it, it would be saying everyone knows, right? Just usual. Everyone knows that this is the case. But in actuality, the truth is set by that particular group. My example for this would be historically with the American Civil War. So historically, and perhaps contemporarily, folks in the North might say the primary cause of the American Civil War was enslavement. Right? On the other hand, historically and perhaps contemporarily, folks in the South might say the primary cause of the Civil War was states' rights. Yeah? If you are in either of those groups, you might think that universally it is understood that those separate ideas are true, right? Forensic truth says that we have secession documents, right, that say exactly why the different states were seceding. Personal truth may have a letter being written from one cousin in the South to another cousin in the North, talking about why he was in favor of seceding. And then a social truth, right, would be that collective understanding from, in this case, a geographic perspective of why people were seceding. All right, hopefully we've got that so far. Let me move to the last truth. The last truth is reconciliatory truth, and that is the narrative that contributes to remedying a perceived injustice. And I use perceived simply because it is about people's perception, all right? That is not a value judgment. So in this case, we might talk about Confederate monuments. Right? There were many reasons why monuments have been erected and why people want to take them down. But a significant reason is contributing to this reconciliatory truth, that there were United Daughters of the Confederacy, for example, who thought that their parents, their uncles, their grandfathers were not being given the appropriate level of understanding for why they fought as Confederate soldiers. And so, to remedy that perceived injustice, they erected a lot of these monuments. Now today, we know that a lot of people think that those monuments should be taken down. And so in order to remedy a perceived injustice, they're saying, let's take those down. The thing with reconciliatory truth is that often when you think that you are remedying an injustice for one group, you may in fact be creating an injustice for another group. That's how it's complicated. For the four truths, forensic truth, personal truth, social truth, and reconciliatory truth, our minds are fascinating, complicated places. And we can hold multiple truths in our minds at the same time, right? Additionally, we don't always know which one of those truths is at the foreground or why we hold that particular truth, right? Sometimes it takes a lot of conscious thought to go backward and say, oh, that's what my third grade social studies teacher taught me. Or I learned that when I was sitting on the porch at my grandmother's house, right? So there are a lot of truths within our minds every time we go to an organization, right? We look at an exhibition, every time we watch a movie, every time we attend a play, that all of these things are playing out. And so when you think about yourself as a member of your arts and cultural organization, also recognizing that you, in fact, may be coming from a forensic truth, and one of your visitors may be coming from a personal truth. And sometimes when conflicts arise, right, you end up wanting to double down on that forensic truth. And so they end up doubling down on their social truth, for example. All right. Let's take just a few minutes again in our chat box to say, on a scale of 1 to 10, how comfortable does it make you that there are multiple truths, right? How comfortable does that make you on a scale of 1 to 10? Just go ahead and put that in the chat box. Great. I see a lot of numbers coming in. Thank you. It is really interesting because some people are very comfortable with the idea that they have multiple ways of seeing things, or there are multiple ways of seeing things. Other folks are much less comfortable with that, right? And that is fine. And some people see the four truths as an open door. So to say, I affirm your personal truth, and now let me share my forensic truths with you, right? It is a spectrum for many people in terms of that comfort. So I appreciate you putting those into the chat box. Hopefully those are tying together in your mind, the idea of the four truths and the idea of perspective from the fable, right? That people are coming at a lot of things in the world from a lot of different angles or different lenses. And we need to take that into account as we are creating things, as we are thinking about conflict and de-escalation, as we're thinking about collaboration, right? And we're getting to that idea of diversity, equity, access, and inclusion, anti-racism. But first, we need to recognize where people are coming from. So hopefully this is a good foundation for all of you. For those who are saying, I am sticking with forensic truth, and that is the only thing that I am doing, I am neutral, I am objective, this is what I am, and this is what my organization is. That's what this next slide is about, right? Implicit bias. We all have biases. Every single one of us has biases, and not just one, multiple. When we talk about implicit bias, we're talking about unconscious bias, right? Things that we are not conscious of. Certainly there is explicit bias, or moments when we are consciously being biased against a particular group of people. But when you look at this, and I would recommend you taking a note so that you can go to the Kirwan Institute for the Study of Race and Ethnicity at some point. It comes out of the Ohio State University. When you look at this, right, it's referring to the attitudes or stereotypes that affect our understanding, actions, and decisions in an unconscious manner. So we don't know that we're doing it. These biases may be favorable or unfavorable, right, and acted on involuntarily. And so when we have these within our subconscious, we may be thinking things about people without knowing, right, without being conscious of it, based on characteristics such as race, ethnicity, age, appearance, the way that they go about doing things. There are a lot of characteristics that we can add into this space. But the idea here, right, is that you may strive to be the most neutral person that you could ever be. You may consciously say, I am the most anti-racist person you will ever meet. And yet we all have implicit biases, right? And we're all working on different things. So I want to make sure that we start with that basis, right? That understanding. Next, in further shared understanding of language, I also want to talk about diversity, equity, access, and inclusion. I'm using the American Alliance of Museums definitions. They have a packet called Facing Change, so you can get more information about any of these definitions. But I always go through definitions to be sure that we are all on the same page when we're using these words and when we're talking about things, because often people interpret these concepts, these definitions, in various ways. And that can really affect how we think about things, but also how we act on these things. So first and foremost, diversity. All of the ways that people are different and the same at the individual and group levels. So even when someone looks the same, right? So if you have identical twins, for example, hopefully those who know twins know that they are very different people, right? And they are individuals in and of themselves. So even when you look the same, there is difference. When we're talking about diversity, it is just about difference. And specifically, when we're thinking about organizational diversity, that means examining the makeup of the group, right? So that might be you as an entire organization. It might be a cross-departmental initiative. It might be when you are thinking about bringing partners on or having a focus group, that you're paying attention to the diversity. And the reason, one of the reasons really that you want to focus on diversity is so that you ensure that there are multiple perspectives. There are people with different lenses and different ideas, right? People who may be more about personal truth and others who may be more about reconciliatory truth in the group. So using sort of a silly example with Skittles, right? Diversity is just that you have a bunch of Skittles in your hand. They're all different colors, right? They taste a little bit different, perhaps. You've just got a bunch of Skittles. So that is diversity. Then when we think about equity, right? And this is the goal for a lot of people. When we think about equity, it is the fair and just treatment of all members of a community. So equity requires commitment to strategic priorities, resources, respect, and civility, as well as, and this is an important part, as well as ongoing action and assessment of progress toward achieving specified goals. When you think about equity, people often interchange equity and equality, right? So equality is very simplistically saying, we can't do anything about the past, so let's just make sure that we are giving people equal things in the future. So that would be if you have a group of people, everyone is hungry, and you give everyone 5 Skittles. That's equality. Equity, though, is recognizing that some people have been excluded in the past, some people have different needs, and in recognizing that, you give people things based on their needs. And so in that group of hungry people, you may say, there are 3 of them who have not had had 3 meals in a day in the past month. And so instead of giving everyone 5 Skittles, you might give those 3 people 10 Skittles and other folks less Skittles because for them, it's just a snack, right? Hopefully that, even though it's a silly example, makes sense. That when we're thinking about equity, fair and just treatment may not look like equality, giving everyone the same thing. Okay. Access is another one of these that often gets shifted around. So when we're thinking about access or accessibility, often people lean on ADA compliance, right? Making sure that we have enough space when we go through doors, right, for wheelchairs, making sure that we have Braille in particular places, making sure that there is someone using ASL on the stage. Often when we think about access or accessibility, that's where we land first. This definition talks about giving equitable access to everyone along a continuum of human ability and experience. So again, that equity word is in there. When we're thinking about access, it may be saying, listen, I know that people in our neighborhood are working folks. And so they're not just working a 9-to-5 schedule. And I need to make sure that our organization is open to them during the time in which they have free time. And so if that means opening early, opening late, having different hours on the weekends, then that's what we'll do to provide better access for the people in our community. Right? If you're thinking about, for example, having students as part of your advisory board, but because of that, you are saying, in order to be accessible for the people that we want to come on board, we need to make sure that we're not going to have an advisory meeting right after school hours, right? You might have thought, of course, I won't make them during school hours, but not making them right after school is something that would make it more accessible for a student to come to your advisory as well. Right? So when we think about access, thinking about the big continuum, how we make space for everyone. Lastly, inclusion, the intentional ongoing effort to ensure that diverse individuals fully participate in all aspects of organizational work. So this is really about that activation, right? Back to my Skittles. If you just have a bunch of different Skittles, that is diversity, right? If the Skittles are being utilized and you're doing different things with them, that is about inclusion. Intentional, ongoing efforts, right? Notice also that I said diverse individuals here. Diverse is not a euphemism for people of color, right? Diverse is not the same thing as Black people. And so when you're thinking about diverse individuals, go back to that definition of diversity to ensure that in being inclusive, you're thinking about a lot of different things, different abilities that people have, different ways that people are learning, different characteristics that may say, I need this particular thing rather than that particular thing, right? All of these work together. All right, let me go on really quick and talk about anti-racism before we pause again. Because a lot of times we also, at least in the past, have paired DEAI, diversity, equity, access, and inclusion work with anti-racism work. Right? And so people are feeling really good if they're doing DEAI work or one of those areas of work and thinking that it is leading them toward anti-racism. But anti-racism is something that is very specific, all right? And this comes from NAC International Perspectives. They say that anti-racism is the active process of identifying and eliminating racism by changing systems, organizational structures, policies and practices, and attitudes, so that power is redistributed and shared equitably, right? So when we are talking about anti-racism, there's again an active component. It is specifically affiliated with eliminating racism, right, through changing structures, etc. And when we're doing this, you may also recently have heard people adding a specific characteristic into that, right? So anti-Black racism, anti-Indigenous racism. So when we're thinking about race, and race is a social construct, right, built upon characteristics, we still use that as something that people separate out by, and therefore still using it as a useful tool in creating more inclusion, right? And doing some of this anti-work. All right, let me pause there. And for this chat kind of response, I want you to connect to something that was perhaps surprising in what I have said. All right. So as you were looking at the DEAI definitions from AAM, or this anti-racism definition, or even the definition of implicit bias when we were talking about that, write out if there is anything that you found to be surprising. I'll just give you a few minutes for that. And if you didn't find anything surprising, I'd also like to know why. Right? I'm curious as to how all of this sat with you and where you are on your journey. For those who don't have a lot to write about right now, please make sure that you're going through the chat box as well and just looking to see what other folks are saying. Again, just by sharing your perspective and seeing other people's perspectives, it will help us all learn a little bit more about ourselves and each other. All right, thank you so much for that. Sometimes when I'm doing training, people tell me, you talk about race a lot, right? Ethnicity, race, anti-racism, that's your space. What about my thing, right? What about sexism? What about ageism? What about colorism? All of the isms. Why do you talk about racism so much? And my response is perhaps more poignant today than it would have been 6 months ago, though no less relevant, right? Or no more relevant, perhaps. The reason that I talk about race so much and racism and anti-racism in a lot of my trainings is because it is the space that the United States in particular has not reckoned with, right? Not to say that other areas haven't had struggles. We continue to see the intersection of race and gender, or the intersection of age and sexuality. We continue to see a lot of work being done in a number of different spaces. That said, it often comes down to race in particular, and I would say Black and white very often, in terms of the United States and what makes people the most uncomfortable to talk about or the least willing to deal with. And I think that we've seen that over the last couple of months especially, but it certainly goes back decades and even centuries. All right. So when I talk about racism, that is one of the reasons. The other reason, of course, is that is part of my lived experience. And so I encourage you, as you are thinking about the ways in which you are moving on your journey, the ways in which your organization is moving forward in terms of diversity, equity, access, and inclusion, and also anti-racism, that you make sure to separate those out. Make sure that you are sure of what you're talking about, right, in each one of those categories, but also thinking about where you currently stand as an individual, but also as an organization. All of them are working together in many ways, but we can't do all of them equally successfully, right? We need to intentionally work on one aspect and build in more aspects as they all work together, but they also build upon each other. All right. With that being said, let's talk about why, right? So a lot of you, I think, are on this particular webinar because you are thinking about diversity, equity, access, and inclusion. You're thinking about anti-racism for your organizations. And so also in that Facing Change booklet from AAM, we're talking about why we need to talk about this now, but also why we need to continue to talk about this. You'll see the picture there is from Brene Brown. It says, the system is not broken, it was built this way, right? And we can talk about a number of different systems as part of this when we're looking to be more inclusive, more diverse, more equitable, more accessible, right? When we're looking for those systemic changes, we first have to recognize that many of those systems were built to work the way that they are working, right? And that may mean that there was one intention and a different impact, or it may have been that intention all along. All right, rather than read across this slide for all of you, hopefully you just take this slide as an affirmation why you should continue to do the work that you're doing. This would also be a good time for me to pause and just recognize, in light of that idea that I said everyone has biases, that as you are working on this, it is both an individual journey as well as a collective journey or an organizational journey. So when I am saying you in a lot of these slides, but also the upcoming slides, I can be jointly talking about you as an individual as well as you as an organization, right? Because an organization is made up of individuals, and individuals influence the work culture, the work product, everything about an organization. All right, so thinking about the commitments that folks have made as we move forward, it will probably not be a surprise that my next slide here is about recent solidarity statements, right? We all have seen, I am sure, a variety of those statements recently that are in line with Black Lives Matter, or you have seen them in support of Pride Month, right? What is often going on behind the scenes, especially if it is a moment of intense urgency? So you see a couple of bullet points there to the right side. The first thing that I have noticed, and these aren't in priority order, is that folks often are writing statements of any kind, right, in those moments of urgency out of fear. Fear of not saying the right thing, fear of not saying anything at all, fear of folks thinking that you haven't done enough or that you've done too much of one thing, right? Often people write things in these moments, right? I'm particularly talking about the last couple of months, out of fear. And because of that, there's often a frustration that comes from communities or individuals seeing those solidarity statements, because folks are looking at those statements within the context of what the organization or the leadership has done previously. And so I think you see a lot of backlash coming from solidarity statements, but that is because people either see them as too weak or too strong in relation to what the organization has been doing, right? And when I say that, I am meaning that the organization may come out strongly and say, we are for Black lives, we recognize the harm that has been done, and yet their actions, right, may have made it possible that they only have a white senior team, right? Or that they have only collected a certain geographic or gender-related art collection, for example. And so the frustration comes from the statement not aligning with the actions. The statements that did the best are the ones that acknowledge where the organization currently is very authentically, and also say, this is what we're going to do, and when you can hold us accountable to the actions that we are proposing, right? Another aspect of these solidarity statements has been reaction and response. So from a psychological point of view, a reaction is something that is connected to survival mode, that people feel very uncomfortable. They want to immediately take some action to make themselves more comfortable again, right? Psychologically speaking. And so reactions are very immediate. They often come from that unconscious or implicit space that we have been talking about. And they often come from the perspective of one or a small group of people, right? They're making a decision, they need to make a decision very quickly. That is a reaction. When we think about response, it's not that that takes so much longer, right, in terms of time, but a response does allow you to step back for a second, gather up your values, right, as an individual or an organization, and then make an action that is in connection to your values. Right? So those organizations, even if it took them the same amount of time as another organization that was more reactive, are coming from this space, and you see the solidarity statements in line with what they've been doing and what their actual activated values are. That is when we see responses. Right? Another aspect of these is scarcity and abundance. So a scarcity mindset is really coming from the perspective that there isn't enough, that we all need to be in competition. And so moving quickly, moving reactively, moving out of fear, right? To grab up the attention, the space, the money that we need in the moment, and not sharing that. Okay? An abundance mindset, on the other hand, is really saying, hey, we're all in this together. We are stronger when we are collaborative. There is enough for everyone. And even if there is a finite amount of something, taking equity into account, that we're actually going to give more to this space, and that's okay, than to another space. And then finally, you've heard me talk about, or at least reference already, intention and impact. And so we pair, as human beings, contemporary human beings, we often pair intention and impact together, that they're the same thing. You've heard people say, I am sure, well, I didn't mean to offend you, with then the implication being that you should not be offended, right? Let's separate out those two things again. Intention and impact are very different. And so I can say, right, I recognize that your intention with this solidarity statement was X. What happened, right, the impact of your statement is actually Y. So let's talk about X and Y together, right? Sometimes intentions are in alignment with impact, but not always. And so as you're thinking about what you do as an individual, but also as an organization, recognize that you can have the best of intentions. You can be a very well-intentioned person. And that does not mean that the impact for someone else or the community or the organization as a whole will be positive just because you are well-intentioned. Okay, let's take a moment with that as well. Outside of these solidarity statements, right? When you're thinking about these 4 different bullet points, you can say, which of the 4 do you feel like you as an individual or you as your organization needs to work on the most, right? So of the 4 different bullet points, you as an organization, you as an individual, where do you think you need to work the most? Great. I see some coming in. I appreciate those. All right. Also, of those 4 bullet points, where do you think you are the strongest in this moment? Of those 4 bullet points, where do you think you are the strongest? All right, I'm going to move us on. When we think about how to succeed in this space, right? So I was saying we need to make sure that we are responding, that we are coming at it from abundance, that we are recognizing impact, right? All of that stuff. How do we succeed? So here are a couple of just very clear bullet points that you can put into action. When you're thinking about what to do next, specifically, again, going back to diversity, equity, access, and inclusion, and your anti-racism work, these are the things that you need to keep in mind. Make sure that you are differentiating when you're working on diversity, when on equity, when on access, when on inclusion, when on anti-racism, that they all work together, right? But what are your success measures? Once you have those success measures, right, this is how you keep yourself true, right? This is how you dive in deep. Stay true to yourself, your organizational values, perhaps your mission. Reframe, realign, or even recreate your plan. I can't tell you how many different clients I'm currently working with who are saying, our strategic plan no longer makes sense. Help us think of a new strategic plan, even if it's just for the next 18 months, right? To transition us from the clarity that we have right now, knowing that a lot is going to happen in the next 18 months, help us recreate our plans. Be open and willing to reframing, realigning, and recreating your plan. Fear is natural. It is going to happen. Conflict is something that always happens, right? We can't avoid it. So take this moment to commit to yourself that you are going to turn fear into opportunity, right? How are you going to take that moment and recognize that you're afraid of something, and then really delve into what you're afraid of and how you can work through it? Consistently work toward your vision, right? That goes along with being true to yourself, that you have a vision, you recognize what your plan is, and you continue forward, keeping an eye always on where you want to go. The next one, I wish I didn't have to say. I wish it were just a part of everything that we do, but it's not. Right? We need to take care of ourselves. If we can't take care of ourselves, we certainly can't help others. If we don't learn first, we can't help others learn. And that is something that is very, very important as you all move forward in this work. Right? A lot of people want to just do a program, or they want to do focus groups, or they want to show a movie. Right? There are a lot of external actions that folks focus on. But if you don't have your own house in order, right? If you are not sure where your own biases are or the institutional history of your organization, you need to start there. Take care of yourself first before you can take care of others. And that goes both literally in terms of making sure that you are centered, but also that you have done the work that you need to do. Keep perspective. Things can get very overwhelming very quickly. You're going to fall down. It's going to happen. And so as new funders come on, as city councils make decisions, as schools decide what they are going to do and what they're not going to do. Keep perspective of what your organization or you as a person, keep perspective of where you are and where you want to be, but also what your strengths and your challenge areas are. So if you are not the best person to be the leader of your DEAI work, for example, don't volunteer to be the leader, right? Know where you stand, keep perspective of the goal, and ensure that if you need to be in a place of learning, that you are a learner. If you are in a position of leadership, right, what it means to be a leader. Remember that this is a journey. One of the things that I've heard more recently is this is not a moment, it's a movement, right? Other times we talk about this being a marathon. So just like it being a movement or it being a marathon, think about when you need to speed up, when you need to slow down, when you need to refresh yourself, right? It is a process. It is a continuation. You don't know where you're going to end up. And finally, take the first step and then take another one. When working with organizations, they end up pausing and getting stuck because they can't figure out how to take that first step. They want that first step to be a big one. They want it to be the right one. They want to show everyone and get the affirmation that they have done something, right? It's important just to take that first step because the next step will be easier. And after you've taken 10 steps, you might think that you're further along than you are and you can take a break. Sure, take a break, but don't allow yourself so much time that you stop taking steps, right? Because it's easier to keep momentum than to start it. All right, in the chat box here, looking at the, 8 different bullet points. Just put in the chat box as a commitment to yourself, right? Which of these 8 you want to focus on first. So just as a commitment, you are putting it out there into the world. Which of these 8 do you want to work on first? All right, thank you for sharing. Let's a couple of more, please. Wonderful. We'll keep moving, but feel free to add as I continue on. In the title, we were talking about resilience. And some of you may have been sitting here for the past 60 minutes saying, when are we going to get this part? Hopefully, you recognize that I have been building blocks for you all, right? That we need to think about perspective. We need to think about people coming with different truths. We have to think about implicit bias and how it works with diversity, equity, access, and inclusion. How all of those things connect to anti-racism. Right? All of this is building on top of each other. When we think about the commitments that we make, those are words, and words are important. But then we get to the actions, and actions are often more difficult. And so when we are thinking about what we're doing, we have to take into account, or I hope that you take into account, the idea of resilience. All right. We recognize that life isn't planned out already, at least in my point of view, and it certainly doesn't come with a map. And so sometimes you get yourself off track. Sometimes you end up going through a snowstorm, perhaps, right? Life is interesting in that way, but it can also be disconcerting. And so the American Psychological Association says that psychologists define resilience as the process of adapting well in the face of adversity, trauma, tragedy, threats, or significant sources of stress. As much as resilience involves bouncing back from these difficult experiences, it can also involve profound personal growth. Right? So falling down is something that is going to happen. And actually, we have to fall down in order to learn. And being resilient is really about recognizing when you fall down, taking a moment to recognize that you have fallen, right? To take stock of where you are, and then to figure out how to get back up. That's what I think about when I think about resilience. I also, I'm sure, italicized in my mind the idea that it is a process and it is about adapting well. And so with those two things, practice is important, right? The more you practice, the more you can master the skill of resilience, the faster you can get yourself back up, and the less scary it is when you fall. You see here, I said resilience as empowerment. I'm encouraging each of you to feel empowered by that idea, that you can fall down and you can confidently figure out how to get yourselves back up. Right? So similar to what I did a few slides ago, giving you all 4 major bullet points in terms of practical application, but also 4 subpoints for that as well. So the first one, prioritize connections, relationships, and partnerships. Often when we fall down, right, or when we are uncertain, or when we make a misstep, we tend to isolate ourselves, right, either purposely, right, or unintentionally, because we feel alone, and therefore we make that a reality. So when things are happening, right, whatever those things may be, it could just be the fact that you are getting a new CEO or a new executive director. You're getting a new board chair. You're moving the location of your organization. Any of those things are stressors, right? And so those are the moments when you really need to lift up the idea of connection, that you need to lean on your relationships and your partnerships. You don't have to do everything well, and you certainly don't have to do everything by yourself. And if you practice that in moments that are not traumatic or not high stress, then those people and those organizations will hopefully be with you during the times of stress, right? They can be your ambassadors as you move through the world. Next, take care of your mind, your body, your spirit. That can be thought of individually, of course, but as I've been saying, individuals make up an organization. And so thinking about your organization, the collective people within your organization, and their minds, their bodies, and their spirits as a collective, I think that's really important, right? As you're thinking about your workplace culture, the way that you celebrate people's high notes as well as recognize their low notes in their lives, right? Thinking about that. I also said here, don't fall into negativity or fear traps. That goes back to what we were talking about, those fear mindsets, the scarcity mindsets, right? Don't fall into those traps, because when you do, you end up making reactive decisions. And sometimes those reactive decisions lead to more reactive decisions, and over and over and over as it snowballs. And so if you can get yourself out of that space, if you can jump over that trap, right, the more you can see them coming, the faster you can figure out how to find your way around or across or over them without falling in. Third here of the major bullet points, find your purpose. Again, personally as well as an organization. I've been working with a lot of organizations again recently who have their missions, they have their visions, they don't necessarily articulate their why, right? Their purpose. And their purpose may simply be to connect people in the community. So think about what your personal purpose is. Hopefully it aligns with the organization that you work for, but make sure that you consciously know, right, the purpose that you hold most dear, as well as your organizational purpose. I think that then will help you to be proactive in looking for opportunities, in looking for teachable moments where you can learn lessons. And that proactivity will also feel like empowerment, right? As you take into your own hands the idea of learning, of moving, of being slightly uncomfortable as you move through your organizational space or your individual space. Finally, embrace that everyone is doing their best. And I find that sometimes I have a lot of trouble with this. I find that other people often have a lot of trouble with this as well. I like to think that people are not doing as well as they could be doing, or they're not putting their best foot forward. Embrace that everyone is doing their best. And in that, right, it helps you have more positivity in your life, but it also recognizes if someone is struggling, it may be the best that they can do in that particular moment. And so hopefully that will encourage you to reach out a supportive hand, right, to help them in that space if you think that they're doing their best and their best is just a struggle at the moment, right? And then finally, accept that change is a part of life. So just as we fall down, we get back up. Just as we have hard times, we also have light times. And so all of this continues to move and evolve, and what is happening right now may seem so far off 3 more weeks from now, right? So always keep that purpose, keep that perspective, recognize that this is a journey, but a part of journey is movement, and a part of movement is change. All right. With that, I am going to stop my screen share here. It is about 3:12, I think, and we've got
You mean 2:12. You're in a different time zone, Dina.
It is true. I am in Eastern time zone. Thank you for calling that out.
You're welcome.
We have about 15 minutes here.
I do have a couple questions. One, I love that last part because I think that actually underpins everything that you've said to us, that you have to be brave. And it also implies that, yeah, you may suck a little bit in the beginning, but the point is not to quit and to persevere and to continue to move through. So I do have a couple questions, but first I want to thank you for a really thoughtful and detailed presentation. I think oftentimes collectively in the field we get overwhelmed because we just hear they turn into terms, right? And we have a hard time really distinguishing sort of what is the difference. And that is, it is those differences and those subtle nuances that allow for stronger programming, for stronger reflective work, whether you're looking at your mission, your vision, values, or your strategic statement, and or your programming, whether it is through your exhibition programs or your community engagement. So having a sense on how to really sit in with these definitions and begin to examine our processes as well as our personal selves makes a real difference. So a couple of questions, and I realize we have a little bit of time, but one of the things that that was asked, if you could provide maybe an example from an organization that you've worked with where they were able to exercise that commitment to DEAI and anti-racist work and resulted in real change. You don't have to, the guilty and the innocent will remain nameless, but if you could give us a practical example of something like that.
Right. So often when I am working with organizations, we start with an assessment. And that assessment, in my mind, and the way that I describe it, is like holding up a mirror to the organization. And so the way that they see themselves may not be the way that the community sees them, or the way that the senior team sees them may not be the way that all of the staff sees it. And so that assessment is really important. And when I work with organizations, doing that first happens. And then there is training, right? Either individual, by department, cross-departmentally on particular topics. And so that's that depth of knowledge, right? We might start with a foundational workshop where we share the language. We make sure everybody's on the same point, and then doing deep dives in spaces that people need. And again, it may not be that the entire staff is doing it. It's not about equality. It may be about equity in terms of the groups that are working. And so I often do that. I'll say with like organization A, we have done that. And when they have done that, then they find that they need to take that agency and that follow through themselves. And so often they'll have people who step up within the organization to then become sort of internal facilitators or trainers. And so using organization A, again, they actually closed one day. So they had an annual internal conference where they had internal facilitators, staff members, who were going in depth about things particular to the organization. And from there, they recognized places that they needed to change or make tweaks to the operational aspect of their strategic plan. And so then they worked through policies and procedures and actually did a reorganization of their org based on that shared understanding, what they had learned over about a 3-month period, what they had realigned through this one-day online conference, and then as they moved forward. And so they saw this as one phase that I think was pretty successful. And they did a second in-person internal conference the next year, kind of following that pattern. So I think that would be an example of an organization I've worked with who assessed, did shared understanding, did group learning to deep dive, and then internally started actively working on policy, procedure, ways that people work together, and so on.
Okay, so I'm going to kind of ask it again, but differently. Yeah. Meaning, if you don't examine it via a process, did you have an organization, let's just say, for example, thought they were doing really great with their community engagement around making sure we were reaching out to diverse audiences, but the reality of the matter is that it was largely demographic, but didn't necessarily reflect the cultures of the communities that they were working with.
Oh,
and it was like this process. So
yeah,
I think what you're saying, but sort of like A to D. B and C, we know, sort of like, I appreciate you laying out the process, because I think that also is, it also demonstrates the fact that this doesn't happen overnight, and that you have said repeatedly that this is a process where everyone is involved at some point in this change. It isn't like 3 people can be committed to it.
Yeah.
So I do understand that, but it's like,
let me try again, but we'll see if I still didn't get this time, we'll pick it up later. So a second example then, specifically with how people worked, right? So they thought that they were doing well, and they did an internal training. And in that internal training, they did a trust exercise, that one where you stand on the line and you're like, take 2 steps forward if you've experienced this. And it was a horrible failure, right? And so they had to go back and start all of that again. I worked with them in that space, right? So where they thought they were doing a really good job, they lost all of the trust of their internal staff and then had to work through that again. That organization, I would say, just kind of skipping from A to D, is now doing decolonization work with an indigenous tribe who that organization lives on their homeland. And so in the course of their process, they went from losing the trust of their entire staff because of the thinking that they had DEAI and not, and now actually doing really good decolonization work, not only through internal processes, but also with their external stakeholders.
Yes. No,
Okay.
your whole face asked, and answering before you finish. Absolutely, that's
Okay.
exactly what I wanted to know. Another question, being sensitive to the time, is can an organization work on DEAI and anti-racism at the same time as an integrated effort, or is it better to separate them?
I think that you can work on it at the same time because they all do connect together, but you have to recognize when you're doing one thing versus another, right? So diversity cannot equal anti-racism when you're doing them all together. And I think that organizations that I've seen have more so been trying to do DEAI with decolonization, and sometimes it works and sometimes it doesn't because it people mesh them all together and they work together, but they're different things. So I would say the same for DEAI and anti-racism, that they can all
Mhm.
work together. You can do it, but you have to be very conscious of using the language and using the actions in the way that they need to be used.
Okay, so as kind of follow up, but it was a different question, but it's specifically in regards to anti-racism and DEAI work. Do you have any tips on how to be a leader in your organization around this work when you don't hold a leadership role?
Yes. So a lot of what I have been seeing lately, it either comes from like HR or it comes from people who are not actually in positions of authority, right? And so a small group of people will get together and decide that they want to do a book club together, something like that. They want to create an anti-racism grassroots group specifically from the general staff. And then that is offered up as something that can go cross departmentally, right? And then is sort of offered up as something that you can bring in your managers to. So I think it can come from multiple directions, but I've seen actually over the past 3 months
The
specifically
microphone's
that there are the general staff is coming up with things that they want to do and doing it themselves from the beginning. I've seen a lot of
okay.
that over the last 3 months.
Thank you. So the last one is a little existential in my view. Um, and you actually have addressed it, but I'm gonna ask it again deliberately because I think to contextualize, and a lot of folks have reached out and said, they really want to begin this process and begin working around it, but they're so concerned that they'll actually cause more harm in their journey to helping.
Mm.
And so, how do you encourage people to really take that first step? Like, how do you encourage them? No one wants to feel like they are working on an initiative that ultimately will already exploit some of the negative impressions that people have about this particular institution, when really they're just trying to figure out how to make it work, or
Right.
how to sort of begin this process and sort of demonstrate it as their action step in response to maybe a statement that they've made.
Mm-hmm. I would go back to the trust building and then some of those bullet points that I said in the resilience space. You don't have to start, you don't have to go from 0 to 50, right? It's not realistic anyway. And so start trust building, being able to talk to individuals or small groups of people who know, again, that you may be well intentioned, but you may fall down and they will still love you anyway, right? People who are willing to answer any question that you have, and you trust that they will share a strong answer back with you and not just something that you want to hear, right? So start small. It's okay to start with people that you trust and then sort of branch out from there the more comfortable you get. Similarly, with the organization aspect of it, you don't have to start with everyone doing the deep level of anti-racism work. You can start with the group of 5 people that you trust and who are really interested in the work. That's okay.
Great. Thank you so much. Well, we have time for a couple more questions if anyone wants to put in the chat box. This is always the challenge with Zooming. It's sort of like you just stare to the side like you're waiting for a message. And in the meantime, it's a lot of awkward silences and people looking at each other's backgrounds. Will this recording be made available? Yes, this recording will be made available And we will have more information to follow. As I said in the opening presentation, that we're also going to send a brief survey so we can make sure that we learn more about the folks that have attended today, but also find out about other areas and topics related to DEAI and anti-racism work, or anything else that you would love to hear presentations on. What time frame is needed for real change?
It depends on what kind of change you're talking about, right? So if you are going from step 1 to step 2, that can be pretty immediate. If you were talking about real change, it takes years. So I heard one example from someone, now I have no idea where it is, right? It takes one moment to destroy trust within your organization. It takes 3 years to build it back up. And I would imagine that that is true for a lot of change, that unless you are intensively and really only working on it, it can take one moment to lose that trust, like I was giving with the example organization. But it could take 3 years to really see a true difference in terms of where you are and where you've been. And some of that is just being able to reflect back.
Great. Anything else? I am sensitive to the fact that everyone has busy schedules, and then there's something called Zoom fatigue, no matter how interesting it is. Well, I want to thank you. I have gotten, just so you know, because you've been laser focused and very detailed, lots of expressions of appreciation for the information that you've shared. A lot of interest around decolonization workshops and other aspects of DEAI anti-racist work. So, you know, Mid-America and Engage thanks you heartily, and we look forward for future workshops. Just another reminder that if you're interested in learning more, working with Dina, or perhaps inviting her into your institution to offer some of that training, or at least begin with surveys, please be sure to reach out to her. The information will be in the links. And again, if you want more information about organizational effectiveness and other practical applications where I can also offer assistance, don't hesitate to reach out to myself or Mid-America as well. I want to thank everyone again, and we're so glad that you're able to join us. And thank you, Dina. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Take care, everyone.
All right. Bye.
Bye. Oh, there she went.
I never know if I'm supposed to actually leave.
Yeah, you can leave. You can leave. I was trying to catch Zandra, but I wasn't able to. She had a question.
Oh, well, I think
I'll email her.
Okay.
Cool.
Okay.
All righty,
All right. I'm going to leave then.
All
Thanks,
right,
Karis.
yeah, no problem.
Okay.
Bye.
Okay. Bye.